Hi, thank you for joining us today. We'll be covering Recognizing Great Pen Test, led by our head of our Renegade Labs department, Ryan Basin. And Ryan, can you tell everybody about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Corey. So as Corey mentioned, my name is Ryan. I lead our Renegade Labs team, which at Risk 360 constitutes our pen testers, red teamers, everyone who looks to evaluate environments, test them with real attacker techniques, and teach how to fix them. Our job is to assess things the way a real threat would assess them. We want to communicate those results and assist people in actually bettering their security postures. That's our goal. All right, so as Corey mentioned, we're going to talk today about how to recognize a good pen test. I'm going to hit you with the bottom line up front. So I'm going to go through, first of all, why we're actually having this webinar. Why did I write the ebook that this webinar is based on? We're going to talk about three key things that I think differentiate a good pen test from everything else. We're going to talk about the scope. We're going to talk about scanning, including the true nature of scanning products, what they're actually doing behind the scenes, how a vulnerability scan truly differs from a penetration test, and then what the findings in a penetration test report should look like. What should you be getting out of them? How can you actually take a report and use it to better your security posture in a way that is demonstrable and that creates assurance with your executive team, your board, your customers, anyone who is using the technology that you are presenting to the world, anyone that depends on the security of the data that they have trusted you with. So bottom line up front, like I said, this is based on an ebook. A lot of those slides reflect, or a lot of the slides in this presentation reflect that. I'm not going to read off of these slides. Most of what I'm going to do is talk about these concepts. The ebook is available right now. There will be a recording of this webinar available afterwards. So if you want to go view that, download it, and read the slides from there, you're welcome to do that. I don't recommend it, but I would just go get the ebook. But I'm going to be talking about this stuff. So bottom line up front, early on, almost 5 years ago now, I joined Risk 360 and we had a budding dream of building a pen test practice. We didn't really know what that meant. We had never done that before. I had never done that before. All of my security experience was either on the blue team side as a more security oriented sysadmin or as a hobbyist hacker, which I won't go into too much detail about, but it was not a lot of practical experience. So when we started this, we were just trying to find people who wanted to trust us to do pen testing. And one of the conversations that we commonly had with people was around the value of pen testing. One of the most common questions that I would get, especially early on, was, you're telling me that the pen test with you is going to cost X amount of money. Why would I do that when I can just go pay $500 for a pen test and be done with it by this afternoon? And not only did I not know how to answer that question, I was personally shocked that pen tests could cost $500. Even though I was new to the consulting world, I had a decent idea about how businesses worked, how people need to get paid for the work they do, and $500 was just an astronomically low number to me. So I have wrestled with this problem of market confusion and honestly, commoditization of penetration testing. It's because it's easy to sell. It's something that everybody needs, whether you're pursuing a compliance effort, whether you're just trying to get a better idea of what your environment looks like, whether you had an unfortunate incident like a ransomware infection or a business email compromise and you don't want that to happen again. If you search penetration testing, whether that's penetration testing cost, penetration testing time needed, you will get all kinds of answers from search results. I would like to cut through all of that and give you the truth, or at least the truth as I see it. Over the last 5 years, we've built an immensely successful pen testing practice. We are very proud of the quality of work we do. A lot of hard work has gone into that, a lot of difficult training for the people on our team. And so we've come out of the other side of that with having made a lot of mistakes, first of all, but having learned a lot about what kinds of penetration testing actually make change, what actually impacts a business's security posture, and how can we provide that better? So what I want to do is talk about how penetration testing can ensure the success of your business and the security of your environment. So first of all, penetration testing is more than just a scope. The first important part of a pen test is aligning to what matters. So one of the first questions that I ask when I get on a call with a sales prospect, someone has come to us and they're saying, I need a pen test. I don't know exactly what needs to be pen tested. I'm not really sure what pen testing is. The first question I ask them is, what is the context? What are you concerned about? What are your goals? The first thing that I want to make sure we're doing when we're pen testing is helping whoever I'm talking to accomplish those goals. If we finish a pen test and those goals haven't been accomplished, then we haven't done our job. We can find every vulnerability in the book. We can compromise the entire network. We could gain full control of the company. But if that wasn't the goal, if our customer didn't get the questions answered that they wanted answered, then we haven't done our job. So from this becomes a lot of conversation about things like threat modeling. If you have an office, do you have a guest Wi-Fi network? Is that a problem for you? Maybe you have an entirely remote workforce. What happens if one of those BYOD machines gets compromised? Do you know that someone's not running Windows 7? If someone else finds out before you do, that can be a problem. So we talk through those. We want to align the pen test results to actual business goals and initiatives. That way, we're providing real value. I talked about threat modeling a little bit. So something else that is pretty common is segmenting penetration testing into a specific scope item. A lot of times, a compliance effort will cover a SaaS application, or maybe it covers a particular office network that is the place a lot of employees get their job done. That's where everybody works. That is where most of the problems, if they arise, can arise. But one of the conversations we want to have is stepping outside of that and saying, okay, so there's a SaaS application. Are your developers on your office network, for example? Have you considered what could happen to that SaaS application if a developer endpoint is compromised? This is not the way that a lot of people think of penetration testing, but this is how attackers think of attacking. So we employ that mindset. That's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we're covering everything. I put some examples here in the slide, some areas that we have found that companies don't consider when they're talking about scoping a penetration test in a way that actually provides value is missing things, important things. One of those we've found is a vulnerable web server, and it was sitting in a DMZ, but it wasn't inventoried. We have used something like that to pivot into an office network. And it wasn't something that anyone was considering. They had no ability to consider it because they weren't tracking it in their asset inventory. So we opened up the conversation to help consider those variables. A second one, we see VPNs all the time. VPNs, by their very nature, have to be exposed to the internet so people can use them. In theory, some of those passwords are strong, but they may be predictable. We have leveraged that before. The last one that I wanted to point out, AWS. We deal with a lot of AWS-centric companies, a lot of cloud-centric companies, even if it's not AWS, Azure, GCP, some of the more like the European vendors, we deal with them a lot. It's very easy to get tunnel vision on those cloud environments and only look at the IP addresses that AWS is presenting to the world, right? Or maybe there's an application sitting in Azure Web Services, and that's what we're focusing on. But nobody's considering what will happen if AWS keys that are stored on a machine are compromised via malware. At that point, your smallest concern is how the SaaS app appears to the internet. Your biggest concern is whether or not those keys have a lot of privileges, and if they do, what happens next. So mapping the threats, understanding what your threat model is, who's actually going to go after you and where is key. And compliance fulfillment. So most of the penetration testing we do is centered around compliance. The other side of Risk 360 is a compliance business that supports SOC 2, ISO 27001, the whole ISO family, really high trust, PCI DSS. It's a lot of our work. And so the environments that labs gets into most often are these environments that are dealing with compliance efforts. So I know I just said to get value out of a pen test, you have to expand your horizons a bit to talk about attack surface and maybe things that aren't considered. I'm going to maybe contradict myself a little bit here and say that a solution that is too big is also not the right solution. If a customer comes to me and they say, I have a SaaS app, I need it tested by a penetration tester because I don't know if it's secure, and I start talking about their VPN, I'm not helping them. I'm not helping anybody. Right sizing an engagement is better than having no engagement at all. So if your penetration tester or your penetration testing team is not focusing, again, on business goals and initiatives, of which compliance is one, to complete that pen test, then that's a red flag. That's a sign you might not be getting the value that you need to get out of it. So scanning, subtitle, is one of my favorite things to say, which is that if it came from a tool, you could have done it yourself. So what do I mean by that? So there are a lot of vulnerability scanning products out there. I won't name any. I almost named a few. That might get me in trouble. But there are plenty out there. And I would expect that a lot of people in this webinar know that. And they purport to do a lot of things. I can't discount that they're useful. We use vulnerability scanners in our jobs. We're pen testers. One of the easiest ways for us to find low-hanging fruit, stuff that we can go after immediately, is to use a vulnerability scanner. But we have to be honest about what scanners are actually doing. So I'm going to use network scanners as an example. Web scanners are a bit different. Network scanners specifically are probing network services, looking for configurations of servers, endpoints, etc. And they're looking for indicators of existing vulnerabilities. They're probing machines and they're looking at the responses and making a determination about whether that machine or that server might be vulnerable to X, Y, or Z documented vulnerability. Some of the people in this webinar might remember Heartbleed back from 2014. There's a pretty clear detection criterion for Heartbleed. If that version of SSL is leaking data, or that version of SSL exists, then it can probably be convinced into leaking memory, which is exactly what Heartbleed was. And people got private keys, passwords, all sorts of confidential information just using Heartbleed. Heartbleed has CVEs attached to it, common vulnerability exposure numbers. So detecting Heartbleed is very easy, but if it's not known, it can't be detected. More sophisticated scanners will look for this kind of thing in non-destructive ways. They'll glean more information. Again, this varies between products, but they are looking for things that are already known. The difference in pen testing, first of all, penetration testers know how to use those vulnerabilities, relate them, chain them together. They know how to interpret the results and use them to their advantage. Scanners can only ever identify what exists, and it's a mile wide and an inch deep. Useful, absolutely useful, but a mile wide and an inch deep. Penetration testing is meant to go deeper than that. So where scanners fail is with more complex stuff, more complex vulnerabilities. Maybe there are vulnerabilities hidden behind authentication layers. It's very common for us to scan an external network range and find absolutely nothing. In a lot of cases, IP addresses, servers, routers, firewalls, they won't even respond to us. But when we move to the second phase of the engagement, where we start past the network boundary in something we call assumed breach, where we're simulating someone who has already gotten into the network, we'll run a scanner and we will find all kinds of things. The external surface is not a good indicator of security for the internal surface. So once we get past that boundary, what can we find? Web application scanners are good at finding some things. We use a web application scanner. You may have heard of Burp Suite if you're familiar with penetration testing at all, or if you have received a penetration testing report for a web app, you've probably seen Burp Suite. We use Burp Suite. One of the things that Burp Suite scanner is very good at finding are, one, SSL issues, web dependencies that are out of date and vulnerable. In a lot of older apps, it can find SQL injection and cross-site scripting from time to time. Some things that it might not be able to account for are more complicated vulnerabilities, like server-side request forgery, indirect object or insecure direct object reference. These things that have to be manually tested for, that in a lot of cases can be so much worse than some of the other things that might be automatically found. These are the things that attackers know exist, and they're going to use if they find. So penetration testing can identify these, and they should. Like I said, if it came from a scanner, if your pen test report came from a scanner, or if a finding in a pen test report came from a scanner, you could have done that yourself, which means you aren't getting any value out of that engagement. So like I said, I don't believe that penetration testers can be replaced by automated scanning tools. There is a lot of discussion out on the internet, in the market even, about automating penetration testing. I'm not saying this just because I don't want my job to go away or that I want to maintain some kind of illusion that maintains my job security. I know what scanners produce, and I can personally attest, and my team could back me up on this, that a lot of our biggest findings don't come from vulnerability scanners. We are not surprised at a lot of vulnerability scanners findings. We can generally predict what they will give us. The high impact findings that we put in pen test reports are, one, things that we could actually exploit. So we don't just put vulnerability scanner findings in reports and hand them off to you to deal with. We want to actually give you a contextual finding, what we were able to do with it. And if we weren't able to do anything with it, we're not going to report it. But we don't just take scanner findings and put them in reports. Our highest impact findings, and this is particularly true for web applications, come from manual testing, areas where APIs are not as secure as they should be, where JWTs maybe are crafted, but leave too much configuration to the user, and we can actually craft our own authentication tokens. This is not the kind of thing that scanners are designed to detect, because they're very custom, they're very granular. But when somebody figures them out, they will have the absolute highest impact on your environment when someone does. Additionally, scanners will rank findings. I'm going to get into this in a little bit because I have a bit of a bone to pick with the way they rank things. Maybe a scan report only has some mediums and lows in it. Anyone who has run a vulnerability scan before has seen the critical in all red or purple if you use some other scanning products. They've seen the mediums and the lows, and as they go through, it's pretty reasonable, to be honest, to think I'll remediate the criticals and the highs and then we'll get to the other ones later. Generally speaking, that's not a bad mindset, except that the right medium and the right low chained together can be highly problematic. And manual testing validates that. Looking at mediums and lows isolated in silos without context doesn't give a good picture of the true attack potential when you consider the whole picture. So I mentioned complex web vulnerabilities. I want to give an example of this. So one of the things that we have found scanners to not be very good at with web applications is finding server-side request forgery. For anyone who's not familiar with SSRF, what this means is there is a configuration or weakness in the application that allows us to convince the application to make requests on our behalf. So we tell the application, hey, go find this resource, go to this URL, request this file, and it does it. And if we had done that ourselves, we would have no success because we are not trusted. But there are internal resources that implicitly trust the web application or the web server. And by convincing it to go and get those resources for us, we can get the information we're looking for. One of the most famous SSRFs from the last 2 or 3 years, or SSRF outcomes, has been by looking at the AWS metadata service. For anyone not familiar with AWS, there is an internal service in AWS called the metadata service that is used for, put simply, validation internally. It's an internal resource. It's not accessible from the outside, but it does hold AWS keys, access keys that can be used to then access an AWS environment if an attacker got it. So whereas we as pen testers from our machines, from our office, from wherever we are, may not be able to see those keys, we can't send requests to the metadata service, the application that's sitting in AWS absolutely can. And if we can see the response, we can take those keys, and then we have much further access than we were ever supposed to have. Suddenly, the boundary that we considered to be this web application, we thought, no need to look at AWS. The web application is sitting in front and that's all that's there. Suddenly that boundary is broken because the web application afforded access to AWS. And a lot of times people don't think of that, but it can be very problematic, again, if you didn't think of it and an attacker does. So a pen test report is more than just findings. So we're going to dive into the mind of a penetration tester here. One of the first things I tell someone who joins my team, and something that we iterate constantly, is that the report is the pen test. In my opinion, if something happened during the pen test, but it's not in the report, it might as well have not happened. Because the best penetration testers can go into an environment, they can write a magnum opus of a narrative talking about how they did this, how they compromised this server, how they stole these credentials. But if they can articulate it in a way that's useful, it doesn't matter. So a good penetration test is a good penetration test report. And we take this very seriously. We have spent inordinate amounts of time getting feedback on our reports from customers of how we can make the reports better, how we can make them more useful. We circulate them constantly throughout our own team, because our own team are often working with customers that we aren't, and they have perspectives that we can use. So we'll ask them, hey, how would this penetration test report be better for your clients? And we'll get that feedback, and we immediately take it and we incorporate it into the report, and we make it part of our template so that every report moving forward is better than the last. We also talk about strategic business moves. So list of findings are really useful. Every pen test report should have a list of the findings. But the findings themselves should support the business improvements. So if we find a lot of well-known vulnerabilities in a network environment and there are patches that can fix them, we will recommend issuing those patches. We will recommend going into the systems, upgrading them if that's what's needed. If it's not feasible to upgrade them, figuring out some mitigating controls. We like to talk through this stuff. But telling you to patch systems, or just these systems, one time, does not fix the problem. If we come back next year for another penetration test, and a slew of vulnerabilities have been discovered, published, and exploits written for in that time, then that first round of patching did not help you as much as perhaps a patching program would, a vulnerability management program. We work with a lot of companies at the business level. So for us to issue a penetration test report that doesn't consider actual business moves, cultural changes, leadership changes that need to happen in order to keep findings from recurring, then we're doing you a disservice. We're not providing value. We should have content in the report that someone can take and action. Another good example of this would be multi-factor authentication. So we often find weak passwords. We can talk about, hey, change these passwords. That is a temporary fix, right? Until someone maybe goes and sets a new password, but it's just as weak or just as attainable to an attacker. We can recommend a stronger password policy, or we can recommend multi-factor authentication. Those are several levels of recommendations that, while they require more business buy-in, they require more cultural shift. will provide more value, and they'll strengthen security posture in a more tangible way. This is my favorite part of our pen test reports. So to break our pen test reports apart, there are three core areas. There's the executive summary, in which we describe those business initiatives. We talk about high-level efforts that a company can make based on the findings in the report. We also talk about strengths. So we talk about things that we found that actually are being done really well. In fact, if a good pen tester is in your environment, they will notice things that you're doing well that stopped them from doing something they wanted to do. So that should be recognized, not just because it's important and it is a signifier of a thorough methodology, but because pen test reports can frankly be punches in the guts. I'll be honest. It is worth getting credit for the things that you have worked hard to do. You can't cover everything. You cannot make everything perfect, but I have yet to be in an environment that did not have something about it that was worth mentioning as a positive. So we'll talk about strengths. We'll also talk about, like I said, the strategic business initiatives. We'll talk about the scope, the purpose of the project, everything that an executive would want to know from that report. The second section is our list of findings. And for us, each finding consists of a few things. The first one is a CVSS score. So we score every finding based on realistic metrics. We don't want to give you criticals that are not criticals. Similarly, we do not want to give you lows that are not actually lows. We take into the context of that finding your environment, the business risk of that finding, because we want to give you something you can actually use. We want to give you justification for a severity if we rank something a particular way. We also provide remediation recommendations. We provide references to best practices that will help with those findings. We talk about the specific impacts. We provide reperformance steps so that if you want to reperform our finding, you can do the work we did, provided you have the tools. If there are specific tools needed, there are unique cases for that, but we try to make that possible for you. And the third section is the narrative. So our narrative is a chronological essay almost of how the pen test went, what we did, when we did it, and how we came to some of the conclusions that we came to. So there are several reasons we do this. One, it gets our pen testers thinking linearly. So we want pen testers to think through the entire process. We want them to consider the context that they're in. It is not enough to just hit finding after finding after finding after finding and never think about how they may impact the business or how they may relate to each other. The process and the exercise of writing out a chronological narrative forces pen testers into this mindset. And I found early on in my career, and this has been true for a lot of our teammates, that we sometimes don't see particular issues until we started writing about them, reviewing our work and thinking, oh, that might actually be a problem. And pretty often we will reach back out to a customer and say, hey, I know our pen test period technically ended, but we think there might be an additional finding here after reviewing. We'd like your permission to go back and try it. And we'll work that out. And sometimes it's a false positive, sometimes it's not. Either way, we added value after the fact. But that comes from writing a narrative. We also want to make sure that those receiving our reports get the best perspective from us as possible. So some benefits of this. One, readers of the report might notice things in the pen test that we didn't because they have contextual knowledge. Maybe there's a file share that we saw that we didn't identify as very important, but the IT team knows is a really big problem. If we dug far enough, we'd find stuff that they didn't want us to find. Again, reperforming actions. We want our readers to be able to do what we did so that they can test and see the process of identifying and exploiting a vulnerability for themselves. It also is a window into the way we think. So pen testers think differently from defenders. There are natural differences there. That's one of the reasons why when we work together, it's so productive. But readers of reports can see how attackers look at an environment versus how they look at their environment, and practice adopting that mindset when they're ultimately charged with defending it. I said that I would talk about risk scoring. So if anyone is not familiar with CVSS, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, this is a way of calculating some metrics, some agreed upon metrics, to ultimately come up with a score between 1 and 10 that will determine the severity of a finding or a vulnerability. And this is important because findings in one area can be pretty severe. The same finding in another area may not. So my example of this, my favorite example of this, I have this on the sidebar if you can read it, is a SQL injection vulnerability. Now, barring this SQL injection cannot be used for something like remote code execution or privilege escalation, it can only read data, then we can assume that maybe the worst version of a SQL injection vulnerability with those limits is in an admin panel of a web application, or I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, is on the front page of a website, something that is publicly accessible. And when you exploit it, it dumps a whole table of usernames and passwords for everyone who uses your application. It maybe could not get worse than that unless you have an application that stores PHI, in which case it would be worse, or PII. But usernames and passwords is still pretty bad. That is what we would consider confidential, or sorry, high on the confidentiality metric. By contrast, a SQL injection vulnerability that's an admin panel of a web application. So if the admin panel is only accessible to admins, that immediately limits the scope, 1, to admins who can log in, 2, admins who know about that panel, and only dumps a table of first names and the rest of the contents are encrypted. That is much less severe than usernames and passwords for users of that application. Now, SQL injection in general is not good. You should always fix a SQL injection vulnerability. And this is a convenient example. But I have to illustrate that findings, either from scanners or from pen testers, have to have justifications behind why they're scored the way they're scored. And I place special emphasis on this because if you are receiving a penetration test report, you more than likely have service level agreements for vulnerabilities ratings. If you're following compliance framework, where you have an information security management system, or you are subject to the Payment Card Industry Council, right? The payment brands, they're wanting to make sure that you're fixing certain severities and as fast as possible. If I'm handing you vulnerabilities or findings in a report that are not ranked properly, then you might spend time on vulnerabilities and findings that you shouldn't be spending. Your time could be better spent elsewhere, perhaps. So I take very seriously the accurate ranking of findings, because if PCI or ISO or any other framework says you need to fix criticals in 7 days or less, and I hand you a critical that is not easily fixed, or maybe even doesn't have a fix in some rare cases, then you're between a rock and a hard place. And that is because I did not score something responsibly or accurately. So we do that with CVSS. We want to make sure that the findings we pass off to you are accurately scored, which is to say fairly scored, and are things that they by their very nature, by their very order of severity, give you a triage list to work from. You don't need to worry about whether or not a critical is going to be actually critical, because we have taken that into consideration while drafting the report. So a final word as we come to the end of this. Penetration testers tend to get tunnel vision. We are curious and driven people. We thrive on our ability to move through an environment, to take advantage of a vulnerability. It's something that we enjoy, but it's easy to get stuck in that. It's very easy to get stuck in just blowing through an environment, hitting vulnerability after vulnerability after vulnerability, and never thinking about the people on the other side of the pen test, the people receiving the report, who are concerned about security. They maybe don't sleep as well at night because they don't know what's going to happen if ransomware lands in their environment. They don't know how bad it can be if the CEO's business email is compromised. Good pen testing requires empathy and an understanding of the environment and the people in that environment. And the results of a quality pen test should communicate risk, and they should assist in building strategies that improve security, that proactively help the defenders defend. So if I could summarize this, every pen tester should do what they can to make the job of the next pen tester as difficult as possible. So we do this on our team. That it is not limited to our team versus any other team. If I do a pen test and I know that one of my teammates is going to be on that pen test next year, I want to make it as hard as possible for them to get findings on their report. And if I have done that, then I have done my job. And if they do that for me, they have done their job. Because if the path to sustainable security improvement isn't obvious following a pen test engagement, you might not be getting the return on investment you deserve. So if I can leave you with anything at the end of this webinar, and we'll have time for questions here in a second, but if I can leave you with anything, I would like for you to take what I've talked about, and if you have a pen test report that you are not sure of or that maybe you were disappointed with, go back and look at it. Your next pen test report, look at it and then rewatch this webinar. And if there's anything in this webinar that you did not get out of that report, you may not have gotten what you were actually looking for. You may not have gotten the value for your dollar or for your time that you should be getting. And I don't like that. I want everybody to get value out of their pen test report. So that is my final word. If I can leave you with one thing, it is a cognitive dissonance that will lead to improvement. So I'll open it up for Q&A. Corey, I'll hand this over to you now.
All right, thanks, Ryan. Did a great job. If anyone has any questions, please just go ahead and put in the question section. The ebook that this presentation is based on, I actually put it. It's in the GoToWebinar. You can go ahead and download it if you like and read through it. It's great information in there. A little bit more detailed even than what Ryan covered. So we have a couple questions. The first one is, I've had scanners report old SSL versions as critical. Why is that?
Okay, so yeah, this has been a recent conversation among some of my friends in this industry. So recently, an unnamed scanning product, and I'm sure it's more than that, has started ranking SSL versions, particularly 2 and 3, as critical. They used to be medium, then they went up to a high, and now they're critical vulnerabilities. And the reason this has become a conversation is because we're all having customers come to us and ask how they're supposed to deal with this SSL version issue when it's critical. They have an SLA that says they need to fix it in a week, or they have a customer that is asking, why do you have critical vulnerabilities in your web applications based on these scan results? Like I mentioned, scan results require context. So SSL, for example, old versions, they, by nature of being old, can be intercepted, and the content and the data can be decrypted by an attacker. However, an attacker has to be in a really significant position to do that. They have to be in a position where they can intercept traffic and do something with it. So they either have to be next to a user on the same network, maybe they have to compromise the network that the web server sits on. Both situations where you probably have bigger problems. So we don't report those on pen test reports because we can't exploit those most of the time. Second, if we did, we wouldn't just rank them critical without thinking about it. We would apply the CVSS scoring methodology to get a real ranking, and we would hand that off. So I'm a bit disgruntled that scanning products have started to do this because it's causing people a lot of real problems for which there aren't easy answers. So I would say if version 2 and 3 is being detected, probably what that means is that the website is just compatible with those versions. So older browsers like Internet Explorer or versions that only use those old versions of SSL can access your web app, that is why. And them being a critical issue is a far off problem or a complicated problem, much more complicated than the scanner is letting on.
Thank you. We have another one. Are external vulnerability scans and pen tests good enough?
They are good enough to understand if you have any externally visible vulnerabilities. So it's like, I believe I mentioned this. External vulnerability scanning, we have done this for penetration tests, and we found nothing. In the same week, we have phished an employee and gotten an internal position in the network and found all kinds of stuff that lets us get domain admin or compromise the network, sometimes in a matter of minutes. But we would not have known that by just doing external scanning. And if we wouldn't have known that, and that is all that you are doing, there's no way for you to know that. So it is good at finding external vulnerabilities, but that is a small part of the story.
Okay, we have another question. How do you feel about internal phishing training?
I actually have strong feelings about this. So internal phishing training, absolutely train employees to recognize phishing emails, train them to recognize phishing text messages, train them to recognize any illegitimate attempt at getting them to share information or download software, anything that, again, is not legitimate. That's absolutely important. What I have to say is that we talk to a lot of companies that do internal phishing training, and they're very frustrated because there's a certain subset of people who keep clicking the link. They cannot report it. They don't learn. And I'll listen to these frustrations, and the first thing I start thinking is, well, okay, is there anything in front of their inbox that is maybe keeping phishing attempts from getting in? And a lot of times the answer is no. And then I'll ask, okay, so if they did get a phishing email and they typed their credentials in, is there an MFA code that maybe if that's not being intercepted by the phishing attempt also, that would protect those credentials from being used? My point is that users are going to get phished. This is an inevitability. They will get phished, they will hand their credentials over, they will download malware. It is going to happen. What matters most is, one, how much you reduce the likelihood of a phishing email ever landing in their inbox. And then two, reducing the impact of whatever that phishing email has, whether that's malware, a credential stealer, any number of things. If you can get in front and have the back of the user, that is the best way to actually make phishing training worth it. You have to look at it in layers. Defense in depth is always relevant.
We have more questions coming in, and a couple comments too. What is the next step after penetration testing?
So I want to go back to the threat modeling idea. We've had the pleasure of working with some companies for a pretty long time, years. And over time, we have done penetration testing for them in the same environment, an environment plus extra targets. And we've actually seen their security posture, their baseline improve over time, because they'll take our recommendations, and not just our recommendations to fix this finding or that finding, but our strategic recommendations. They'll implement vulnerability management programs. They'll get patching cycles implemented. And a lot of times after 2 or 3 years, the pen test doesn't really yield many findings. And that's because they have done a lot of work to not just fix the problems that already existed, but proactively fix problems before we ever come around. And so after that, assuming that your threat model has been fully assessed, the next step is to go beyond penetration testing in a sense that you want to go beyond somebody looking at the logical conclusions of vulnerabilities, using a scanner and hitting everything they can, identifying low-hanging fruit in Active Directory. After that, if it's a web application, it's worth getting into things like building security into the DevOps process, right? Having QA steps, having dev pipelines that automatically check application builds for problems before they ever hit the public internet. If it's a network, then there are areas to look into. A lot of companies will go to red team exercise after that. So they want to know if they don't know that they're being attacked, if they can respond to it. They want to know if they can detect an attacker who's doing something a little bit different. Because the truth is, a real attacker isn't going to install Nessus on a network and run it. They're going to do some other things. So companies will want to know, can we catch a real attacker in real time before they get to something? And there are exercises like red team type engagements that can help with that. As long as they are goal oriented and there are specific things that both the business, but especially the red team, are set out to accomplish, and you can measure the results of that engagement against those accomplishments.
Hey, Ryan, they're coming in pretty quickly now. We have a question from Angela. It's pretty long. So I manage a third-party vendor risk management program. If my company engaged a pen testing company like yours and I'm assigned to complete an assignment, what are the compliance and security questions that are most important to know? She actually is working in a PCI environment right now.
So if they're third-party vendors, one of the things that we like to do, we like to ask for penetration tests. So some of the most high-profile compromises of the last 5 or 10 years have actually come through third parties. MSPs are common targets because MSPs themselves have access to so many other environments that compromising one means the compromise of plenty more. So with third-party vendor risk, especially when it comes to payment card data, I think asking for a pen test or asking if a third party would be willing to undergo a pen test is a good course to take. When that report is received, one of the things that you want to make sure of is that it actually has tangible information in it. So you want to make sure that it has a scope in it so you know what was tested. You want to make sure that you can see the findings and whether or not they were remediated. Again, a letter that says there was a pen test report, as much as I would like to put faith in that, I don't think that's good enough. So if you're managing third parties, set the standard. Make them prove to you that they take security seriously.
Right, and we have one from Andrew. How do I decide what kind of penetration tests should I get? So it says external versus internal versus red team.
So it's worth talking about these engagements. Since you mentioned red team, it's worth talking about these relative to maturity. So having a red team come into an environment and do everything that they do when that environment hasn't employed things as baseline as vulnerability management or network isolation, or maybe they don't even have an IDS or an IPS in place, that's a really unfair engagement in my mind. Penetration testing is meant to be an improvement strategy with a lower required baseline. Red team is much more valuable in more mature organizations. So one, I would say, depending on the maturity of your organization, you can make that determination for yourself. When it comes to different types of penetration tests, I would go back to the threat model idea. If you only have a web application, and that is the heart of your business, all the developers of that application, maybe their remote workforce, then by all means, focus on the web application. The web application needs to be tested, and you should have assurance that there's a reasonable amount of security built into that application. But at a certain point, it's worth looking into other things. Now, with networks, internal and external network, you heard me say that doing an external network penetration test can tell you some things. It can tell you how you look from the outside to an attacker. It can tell you what serious issues an attacker might be able to use. For example, an Exchange vulnerability, a Microsoft Exchange vulnerability. Those have been highly problematic in the last few years. Dell SonicWall vulnerabilities. Heartbleed was a big one. Log4j is the one that I think maybe we all remember quite well. It was almost exactly a year ago. But these externally are huge problems. But these are more rare than internal vulnerabilities. So if you want to know what you look like to the internet to an external attacker, do an external network penetration test. If you want to know what can happen after they use a Log4j or a Heartbleed to get into the environment, do internal. I highly recommend doing both.
Okay, well, Ryan, that's it for the questions. I did have a couple comments to say you did a great job, and I really appreciate the content. Thank you for doing this for the team, and thank you everyone for joining today. We'll have another one coming out pretty soon, and look out for the emails and on social media. And also, Ryan is constantly posting great content, so you can follow on LinkedIn and get as much of this content as you would like to get. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you.